Clear prop.
Star 73 Cherokee number 2 following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Pleasantville. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
Fantastic. So we released an episode on fuel systems. We talked about fuel systems in both Pipers and Cessnas and shared a lot of information. And we got a very interesting question that actually has another question hidden in it that we're going to talk about today a little bit. One of our listeners wrote in and asked us what we think the minimum gallons of fuel should be in a Cessna 172. And that brought up something I know we've talked about offline before, Wally. What's one of your thoughts or pet peeves?
One of my thoughts is I could care less how many gallons. I don't think of fuel as gallons. Okay, now sure,
but we all do, though, right?
Right.
So many people do.
You're right. When you go pay the bill, you say, "How many gallons did I have?" 19 gallons times whatever. Try to think of fuel in minutes. Think of fuel as minutes as opposed to gallons. When I ask somebody how far away they live from my house, a lot of times they'll say, it's about 25 minutes away. And I always want to say, well, I'd rather you tell me 12 miles. And then I can, I know the general direction and I can apply some logic to it and kind of figure out how far away it is. In airplanes, most of the time we're talking about gallons. In smaller airplanes, how much fuel is on board the airplane, 43 gallons, 53 gallons, 50, 48, whatever. But think of that fuel as how many minutes do I have on board the airplane as opposed to how many gallons do I have on board the airplane. And for a couple of reasons. You're going to be flying airplanes that have different burn rates, okay? My Saratoga holds 102 gallons. I don't care about that. It holds, I say it has 5 hours worth of fuel. Burns about 20 gallons per hour and 100 gallons. And again, my bladder doesn't go more than about 3 hours. So if I'm flying with full fuel, it's never really an issue with that airplane. Our 172 holds 43 gallons and burns about 8 gallons an hour. So again, it holds about 5 hours worth of fuel as well. And the reason being is when I when I look at minutes, let's just make some really easy math. Let's say we decide that our personal minimum to land an airplane is 90 minutes worth of fuel. Okay, 90 minutes worth of fuel. And I look at a route. Okay, we're going to fly from point A to point B, and it's going to take this many hours or this many minutes. Let's say it's going to take 3 hours. And we have 5 hours worth of fuel on board the airplane. Well, we're going to land with 2 hours worth of fuel, 120 minutes, and our minimum is 90 minutes. Well, I know I have 30 minutes of extra fuel at this point. So as I'm flying along and I'm hitting my checkpoints, I know I've got 30 minutes of headroom, 30 minutes of fuel capital, if you will. If I hit my first checkpoint, I realize I'm 2 minutes behind schedule. Well, now I know I'm going to land with 28 minutes. My next checkpoint, I'm another 3 minutes behind schedule. I'm now going to land with 25 minutes. And I can kind of project things and say, well, gee, something is going on here that's not, that wasn't in the plan. Are the winds different, or what is going on here? Why am I hitting these checkpoints constantly behind? And so my time at checkpoints equates to fuel.
And you don't want to land with less than 90 minutes, right? That's the reason we set that. I think I've heard or have talked to people that are like, well, I'm only going to be 15 minutes into my reserve, right?
Right.
So they just keep going and
Right.
keep going. And we've
Right.
heard about the accidents and the problems. Like, that's not landing with a minimum of
Right.
90 minutes.
Right.
You can't break that rule, or you really don't have a personal minimum. So
Right.
you need to divert, I would assume, or land or do something
Yeah.
before you got to that where
Yeah.
you got into the problem zone.
Right.
Because we know what happens. We get to our destination, and then we can't land. We have to divert. There's a incident on the airfield. Like, that's why we needed the 90 minutes. That's why we had the personal minimum. So
Right.
don't think that you have enough time left. You have enough minutes left because you built in the 90 minutes. Stick to those hard guns, because we have that for a reason,
Right.
not because I'm coming up short all the way there. Right.
Right. I'll ask applicants, how much fuel do we have on board the airplane, and there's lots of ways that they'll answer it. Some will say full tanks. I might say, well, what is full tanks? 53 gallons. Okay, that's the right answer. But again, I like to think of it as we have 300 minutes of worth of fuel.
Yeah, I flew back from Bedford, Indiana, in a Warrior that was 150 horsepower, and it was in the wintertime, but had strong south winds. We were probably doing a ground speed of 55 knots throughout most of that flight at 8,000-ish feet coming back. If you didn't plan for that, and you were thinking, I'm going to get 10 gallons an hour, to go somewhere, you might run up short for your reserves and all those things, because that was eating up a lot of time as we were trying to turn that prop into that massive headwind. And that's the last thing I'd want to do. Probably if you're ferrying a plane like that, you don't know that aircraft as well, so you really want to be on your A game, and you want to have personal minimums, and you want to make sure you don't ever cheat into those sacred minutes.
Right.
Even on it was a really nice VFR day, but I wasn't going to play around with those. We stopped early on all three of our stops to make sure what we were calculating was not happening. Right.
Yeah. I think if you fly long enough, you're going to find one of those flights where you land and you think to yourself, "Oh boy, I should have gotten fuel 30 miles ago, or that other airport." And for whatever reason, you tried to stretch it. I mean, there's an old saying: better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than to be in the air wishing you were on the ground.
No question. So far, that's only happened to me once, where I was up there and I really was wishing I was on the ground. And I'm sure I'll have more, hopefully not. The other thing that we talked about in the past, and I don't think it was really about the fuel, but it is an interesting story. We've both referenced The Killing Zone, which is a great book. If you haven't read it or listened to it on Audible, I challenge you to go listen to it. There's this mindset of fuel exhaustion that they talked about in the book, of the planes running out of fuel and how many people get hurt that way, that it's often when people think they have enough fuel to go somewhere with no winds. They've done it many times. We'll use an hour away and an hour back, 60 minutes there, 60 minutes back. And they have their fuel reserve in the plane, or they have their own personal minimums. But today there's a headwind going over there and a tailwind coming back. The math never works, does it, Wally? Like, it's not a 50-50 split. You're not going to get it all back.
It's not. Just, I guess simple logic would say, well, gee, this is an hour flight, and today it took me an hour and 15 minutes. So coming home, it's going to take 45 minutes. And it just doesn't work out that way, just simply because you're in the headwind longer. So if it's going to take you an hour 15 going over, it may take you 52 minutes coming back. You're not going to get all of that capital, if you will.
And in that example, we'll call that 15%, although it's not really. You're not going to get all 15 minutes of that back.
Right.
Your math just then was only 8.
Right.
And if you think about, we're talking about teaching minutes versus gallons. How many people come up just short of the runway or just short of the airport because of these miscalculations?
Yeah.
Minutes become very valuable.
Yes, absolutely.
Especially if we say don't go across that threshold of, if my time is 90 minutes, land with 90 minutes.
Right.
If you land with 85, you broke a rule
Right.
that could come back to haunt you for many years to come.
And now back to Behind the Prop. Here's part 2 of this week's special double episode.
We released an episode about ownership versus renting, etc. And we talked a little bit about the cost of insurance and some things, but the question came up about renter's insurance and what do I expect from my flight school, etc. We thought we would jump on and knock out a quick episode to kind of help answer some of those questions. Of course, as a owner of a flight school that requires renter's insurance, I get a lot of questions, why and what and how much and how often, blah, blah, blah. And there's just a lot of unknown out there. I think in a simple overview of it is, I think renter's insurance is the only cheap thing in aviation. Everything's really expensive, and renter's insurance costs money, but it's not that expensive for what you're getting.
Right.
Auto insurance, my son, I pay probably $350 a month for my son's insurance. Just turned 16. We got 4 cars in the family. It's expensive. Renter's insurance is less than that for any aircraft you want to fly individually for an annual basis, right? So
right.
Renter's insurance is fairly inexpensive. But most flight schools probably have some sort of requirement for renter's insurance. There's probably an aircraft damage amount, which is what everyone thinks about more often than not, and then a liability amount. And that's really, oddly enough, what insurance companies think about. I think insurance companies, their risk mitigator is really the big one, right? So hits something, damages property, injures people, that's where they're going to be out a lot of money. They probably think like we do from a pilot's perspective, says, look, airplanes can be replaced, take care of life and people first, and we'll get the aircraft. If it's bent, we'll either unbend it or get another one, right?
Right.
The damage component, while is a significant part, probably isn't the biggest piece to the insurance company. I asked my insurance guy a question last year at renewal time, and he's like, you are very focused on what it's going to be, the value of the aircraft, the whole value, the whole insurance, the metal part. And he goes, we're really worried about someone walking through your hangar and cutting themselves on their arm, just walking past a piece of sharp metal on an aircraft and what that could do, right? And I guess I just didn't think from that perspective. So insurance is probably my number 2 biggest expense. Maybe pay and then insurance right there somewhere around that mark. But it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And what renter's insurance is actually doing is protecting the it's called non-owner owned insurance. It's for you to fly a plane that you don't own. Like if I were to come fly your plane, Wally, I probably wouldn't come fly your plane alone if you would even let me, if I didn't have a non-owner owned renter's policy. Because I wouldn't want you to be at risk for anything that I might do. And the reality is it might not have anything to do with bad piloting.
Right.
You can bend metal. I've seen a lot of metal get bent when the pilot did nothing wrong, right?
Yeah.
I've seen tires blow out. I've seen lots of things happen. How about acts of God? We've had some bird strikes that have caused significant damage to the airplane. And maybe that wouldn't be something that an insurance company would ask a non-owner owned renter to pay for, but somebody's going to end up paying for it, and I would rather be protected.
Yeah.
I guess you've been around a long time, but maybe not from this side, Wally. What are your thoughts when you first think of renter's insurance?
Well, I think renter's insurance is almost sort of a new thing. I know me growing up in learning to fly back in the 1980s and doing a lot of flight instruction back then. Again, it's a long time ago. But I don't even know if renter's insurance was available.
Maybe not.
I never had it. The flight schools, I worked at 2 different flight schools, actually three different flight schools, and it was not required. It just wasn't something that was on the radar screen. And then, I don't know, when I got back into flying little airplanes, probably 6-7 years ago, it was about 50-50. About half the flight schools required it, but some of them still did not require it. Now I think it's more the norm than not so the norm. But I would say that the limits of liability are different depending on the flight schools. One flight school may want a certain amount, another one may want a different amount. I've heard of people buying a policy and then going to another flight school and it didn't quite meet their minimum liability requirement, so they had to up the policy. Luckily, the insurance companies will usually let you just go in and say, hey, I want to change this from X to X plus whatever to up the amount.
Yeah, it was a big decision in the last year where we went from being a flight school that didn't require it to becoming a flight school that did require it. And it really is just the mass expense of insurance and what insurance companies want you to do to limit their risk and liability. And so we had to take that step as well. And I think we probably are a little bit on the higher end as it relates to hull value. Most flight schools, I think in the Houston area, somewhere between 15 and 25. We went with 30 to be, I guess, the one time where we weren't raising that year after year and just figured we would hopefully be able to stay there for a long, long time. And that's probably where the difference in the expense comes. I think most probably have a $250,000 liability and $25,000 per passenger as the minimums for in-movement type stuff. But it is something that I think you would be remiss to not have, whether your school was requiring it or not. There's this thing that insurance companies call subrogation. If they choose to come after you, even if the fleet policy is primary, that doesn't mean that they don't choose to come after you. If the school or the club or something that you may rent from or go to doesn't have a subrogation clause for their renters, you are at risk for being subrogated, which means that if they think you're negligent or could be at fault and they could come get your insurance company's money or your money, they're going to do that. So insurance is one that I would not flirt or play around with. It's a big deal. Planes cost money, and there's a lot of liability when we're in the air, and something could possibly go wrong. So my advice, get renter's insurance. Someone walked in the other day with a renter's insurance policy. I'm normally looking to make sure that the amounts meet our amounts because they're more often than not just shy. This gentleman had $100,000 whole value insurance, and he said, look, the expense is so small, I don't want to ever be at risk. So $100,000 is a fairly significant renter's insurance policy for these small single-engine aircraft. But some clubs that fly 206s and other things, they have $300,000 requirements. Like they're not going to let their plane ever be at risk, and you are pilot in command on something like that. So it's an interesting paradigm if you think about the types of aircraft that you could rent with a renter's insurance policy. Anything to wrap with, Wally, as we reflect on renting and owning last week or Monday, and then really what we're talking about today as it relates to insurance?
No, and I would just say that when you do have a renter's insurance policy, you basically get to take it with you wherever you go. So if you're at flight school A and then you move or you go to a different flight school, that policy is going to go with you. So it's not assigned to a certain flight school.
Yeah, and probably we're talking between $350 and $550 on the numbers that we're talking about, depending on where you're at in your aviation career. And so you spread that out, you're talking $50 a month on the high side. That's $1.50 a day. That's not that bad.
Right.
No doubt. As always, thanks for listening. Stay safe and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.